Here's something fun. Celebrate spooky season with Parcast Presents Halloween. This new podcast series on Spotify brings you 3 blood-curdling episodes each week in October. From urban legends to haunted places, Parcast Presents Halloween takes you on a historical tour of terror. Hear the stories of an escaped killer on the prowl, a gruesome discovery by 4 young friends, the legendary killings of Salem's first witches, and more. Search for Parcast Presents Halloween in the Spotify app and start listening for free today.
True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Michele Wallace was a freelance photographer who disappeared hiking in Colorado back in 1974. She was a free spirit, a pretty and adventurous 25-year-old woman with long dark hair that she liked to wear in 2 thick braids. It was late August when Michele told her parents she was going on a backpacking trip with her dog in the Rocky Mountains. Many parents would have been worried, but Michele was an experienced traveler. Her parents trusted her to be safe. But smooth-talking deviant Roy Melanson was unlike any predator Michele had ever encountered before. When she found herself alone in her car with him, her fate was sealed. Melanson had a history of abducting and raping women, and Michele wouldn't be the first woman he murdered. It took nearly 20 years for investigators to get justice for Michele, and that was after a new detective and new evidence came into the picture. When Melanson was captured for Michele's cold case, his DNA was entered into CODIS, helping to solve another murder from 1974. Join us at the Quiet End today as we discuss the disappearance and murder of Michele Wallace and how solving her murder led to taking a dangerous man off the streets and solving at least one other murder, that of 51-year-old Anita Andrews.
So the beer for today is a nice Colorado beer called The Reverend. It's brewed by Avery Brewing in Boulder, and it's a Belgian quad at 10% alcohol by volume. This is a big sipping beer. It's a dark gold color, very thick white head, tons of lace, very pretty looking. Nice aroma. You might think this is strange, but it smells like a boozy lollipop.
Okay.
And it tastes like fruit. Some candy, like those penny candies you suck in your mouth.
Yeah.
Some caramel, some alcohol, and a little funky yeast. Good beer. Go slow.
Now this is called The Reverend, so...
Yes, you're only supposed to drink it on Sundays.
Okay, well, we're going to just say it's Sunday.
Okay, it's Sunday here, so we're going to drink it.
That's right.
No, I'm only kidding about that. I don't know if there's any stipulations on when you drink it.
Okay. So let's open it up.
Pop that top, head to the quiet end.
All right, down at the quiet end, finally again. I've missed it down here.
Well, it's kind of quiet today, isn't it?
Yeah, I like that.
But we'll see. There's always a few people around.
Sure.
So let's talk about this guy. Roy Melanson had a lengthy arrest record. And you have to wonder why he was out walking around free enough to kill the 2 women in 1974. He had prior convictions for impersonating an officer, forgery, burglary, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, and rape. He served just over 5 years for rape and was released in 1970. 2 years later, he was accused of 2 additional rapes. This time he skipped bail and was on the run when he turned up in Colorado in 1974. So he was a pretty tall guy, easily over 6 feet tall. Not real handsome, but kind of rugged looking, and he thought he was a real ladies' man. And beside that, he was a skilled liar and a very good manipulator. As a 37-year-old, he had been sailing through life, mooching off of others, and just pretty much spreading bullshit wherever he traveled.
Absolutely. Just one day after he arrived in Grand Junction, Colorado, Melanson met 40-year-old Frank Spadafora in a bar. Spadafora told Melanson that he owned a sheep ranch in a small town west of Crested Butte. Spadafora said he needed to hire someone to shoot coyotes who were preying on his sheep, and Melanson said, "Hey, I'm just your guy for this job." At this time, Melanson was actually broke and homeless. Taking this job gave him the use of a cabin, a sleeping bag, and a rifle. But Melanson really didn't do much as far as work, especially after he met Lucille Burton and her 5 daughters. So they were nearby. Lucille's husband was working in Pueblo while the family was spending their summer in the cabin. Melanson took very little time before he latched onto these women and girls.
I tell you, and an unaccompanied wife and 5 daughters.
I know, it's like a nightmare.
Yeah,
this
targets.
guy, absolutely. But to the Burtons, Melanson was this worldly, interesting guy. He told them that he was an experienced horseman and that he spoke fluent French. And not long after meeting the family, Melanson took one of the girls' teenage friends out on a horseback ride. And they thought nothing of that. But when this girl returned, she was quiet and really kept to herself. And it would come out later that Melanson had raped her while he had her away from the house.
Now, he seemed to be most interested in the Burtons' 14-year-old daughter, Sally. He spent most of his time with her. So much time, in fact, that Spadafora fired him because he wasn't doing any work for him. Now, unfazed, Melanson moved in with the Burtons. When it was time for the Burtons to return to Pueblo, Melanson convinced Lucille Burton to leave Sally, her daughter, behind with him.
So isn't that strange?
How did that work?
Well, that's the thing, is the whole point here is he was supposed to be very convincing and come across as a nice guy.
He must have been.
I mean, I still don't see how you could leave your 14-year-old behind. There had to be, I don't know, well, at least some ignorance there to let that happen. Because it was a nightmare.
Well, I'm just, besides mystified, I'm just really bothered by why a woman, a mother, would leave a 14-year-old in the care of this guy that they basically just met.
Sure, I know. It's really not good decision making, that's for sure. Because he was an absolute predator. Yeah,
because she was kept in the cabin as his prisoner, and Melanson used her as a sex slave for weeks. He did finally put her back on a bus, headed to Pueblo. Now, he told her he's going to join her soon, and he even purchased a bus ticket after he hitchhiked to Gunnison, Colorado. But as he waited for his bus to depart, he went into the Columbine bar to have a few drinks.
So this was August 29th, 1974, and ranch hand Chuck Matthews was drinking pretty hard at the Columbine bar, which he had a tendency to do. This was after a long day of hard work. Roy Melanson sat down at the bar and started up a conversation with him. He told Chuck his name was Roy, and over several beers, Melanson told Matthews that he owned horses and a cabin in Schofield Park nearby. He said he'd been having trouble with a bear on his land, and he asked Matthews if he knew anyone who could help him out. Matthews had a rifle back at his house, so he offered to go get his rifle and ride a couple of Melanson's horses around to find the bear and shoot it. So this must be a drunken idea, because it doesn't make much sense.
It's one of those ideas, at the time it sounded really good.
Yeah, right.
But on further consideration,
maybe
it probably wasn't such a good idea.
Yeah. So the two of them went into Matthew's beat-up car to the ranch where he worked, and they picked up Matthew's rifle and his saddle. Then they headed out to the Burtons' cabin, where Melanson was still staying, but by then it was dark and they ended up just sleeping off their drinks that night.
Then the next day, which was August 30th, Melanson had a new story for Matthews. Now he was telling him that he had rented out his horses to a man who hadn't returned them. The horse renter also owed money to Melanson, and he asked Matthews to drive him to the man's house to collect both his money and his horses. Then on the way, maybe they could see the bear and take care of him too. Well, sure, why not?
Right. But of course, the whole story that Melanson's giving is false. There are no horses. There's no one who owes him money.
Right.
But Matthews agreed, and they took along Melanson's toolbox in case the old car broke down, because it did that often. The two men stopped to buy beer on their way, and they drank more as they went. But Melanson had trouble locating the cabin where he was supposedly going to find his horses and his money. And Matthew's car broke down with engine trouble more than once. Also, one of the tires had a slow leak, so this was pretty much a disaster.
Yeah, they're not going to get much done, are they?
No. But Melanson insisted on going down dirt roads to look for the bear, so he was up to something. On one of the roads, Melanson asked Matthews to pull over. He said he had seen something and maybe it was the bear. So Matthews, he's drinking beer and just kind of agreeable, pulled over and got out of the car. He gave Melanson the rifle and walked to the edge of the woods, where Melanson was pointing out the possible location where he might have seen the bear. So when Matthews turned back to Melanson, he said he saw a strange look on his face, like Melanson seemed to have changed his mind about doing something. So he put the rifle back in the car and they drove off. And Matthews would look back at this as maybe he was pretty close to being murdered that day.
Yeah, you think it was his time to get shot?
I think that was what was being considered, sure. I think Melanson had something in mind like that.
But something had stopped him. Or at least that's the impression we get.
Yeah.
So on the way back to the Burton's cabin, they stopped at a gas station to put some air in the leaky tire, and they had to buy some more beer because they were all out. And they continued on their drive toward the cabin.
25-year-old Michele Wallace had just returned from her Labor Day weekend hike in Schofield Park that day. She was probably sad to leave the mountains because she did love them, but also she would have been excited to be driving to North Carolina for her first professional photography job. She'd be helping to document the lives of people living deep in the North Carolina mountains, and she wanted to record their way of life before progress just totally pushed them out of the area. Michele had returned to her hometown of Chicago early that summer for her brother's wedding. With her family around her, she'd entertain them with her stories of camping in South Carolina, of photographing wildlife and birds, and how she'd had some near escapes with snakes. And her father had made a remark on Michele's strong sense of adventure and bravery. He was proud of her.
Yeah, they were pretty used to Michele's adventures. She had always been a pretty independent person, kind of fearless, and was definitely open to new things. Known by those who loved her as Mush, short for Michele, she was the brightest part of her mother's life. Although Michele was away and busy, she always called Maggie Wallace at least once a week. Now, she was not only brave, but she was strong also. She had once worked exercising polo ponies for a Chicago club. She had also worked for some time on a ranch, helping to castrate bulls.
You have to be tough for that stuff.
You have to be pretty tough working on a ranch, yeah.
Absolutely.
So Michele's parents probably felt pretty confident that Michele could take care of herself.
Sure, I think they had reason to believe that. She had in the past. In 1974, Michele really had her whole life ahead of her. She had a lot of plans. She was beautiful. She had these big brown eyes, a pretty face, thick wavy dark hair. She had left on her hike on September 27th, bringing her large dog Oki along with her, and she was always careful to let people know where she was going and when she planned to return. She'd also invested in some high-quality camping gear, so she was prepared. Then on August 30th, Michele decided to return to Gunnison, and that afternoon, as she exited the trail, she saw a beat-up car with two men inside coming up the road. The driver stopped and offered her a beer, and Michele accepted the bottle, took a sip, and returned it. The driver told Michele that they were going up the road and they could give her a ride in a few minutes when they came back her way. So a few minutes later, sure enough, the men were back. They had a leaky tire, the driver told her, but they could probably make it to the next town. So Michele accepted a ride, and she got into the back seat with her dog. But they only made it a few hundred yards before there was a loud noise and the car jerked.
So the two men that Michele was with that day, no surprise, turned out to be Chuck Matthews and Roy Melanson. So Chuck got out of the car and looked underneath the chassis and saw that a rock had put a hole in the oil pan. So Michele offered to give the men a ride in her car once they made it to town. So they got to her car. Matthews got into the back seat with Okie, and Melanson rode up front with Michele. Michele drove them back to Gunnison as Matthews bonded with Okie, and Michele chatted with Melanson.
Yes, it was late afternoon when they arrived back at the Columbine bar. Matthews was really surprised, though, because then he overheard Melanson ask Michele if she could drive him a few more blocks to where he'd left his truck. Now, he hadn't even mentioned a truck to Matthews. Matthews didn't think he had a truck. I mean, if he had a truck, why had they been riding around in his old, terrible junker?
Which had proven itself untrustworthy.
Absolutely.
Kept breaking down and leaking air and stuff.
Sounds terrible.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Why are we taking my old junker?
Yeah, but he didn't say anything. And Melanson told Matthews he'd be back in a while and rode off in the passenger seat of Michele's car. So Matthew went into the bar, but he was confused, and he decided he'd wait for Melanson to come back, and maybe he could give him a ride home in his truck. But when Melanson hadn't returned by 9 p.m., Matthews called a friend to pick him up, and he thought that would be the last he'd hear of this whole thing. But the next morning, Melanson drove Michele Wallace's red Mazda station wagon to the JCPenney store in Gunnison, and he wrote a fraudulent check to purchase a dress shirt and pants. George and Maggie Wallace, Michele's parents, were back in Chicago, thinking that everything was fine. Michele was alive and well and would be back soon. They were really happy that she was going to be working as a photographer in North Carolina. But September 2nd came and went without a call from Michele, and she'd promised Maggie that she would call her that day. So Maggie called the sheriff in Gunnison to report Michele missing. Of course, it had only been a couple days. She was an adult, so the dispatcher told her not to worry. Her daughter had probably just decided to camp for another day or two and forgot to call her. But Maggie knew better. She knew Michele, and she insisted that Michele would never do that. So she persisted, and she actually got the sheriff's department to talk to her and to search Schofield Park. So the next morning, the undersheriff went to Michele's apartment and saw that she had never returned from her trip.
Yeah, so they figured that Michele could have had an accident in the rugged country. So the undersheriff called the Crested Butte Police Department and asked them to look for her car. And they called him back that evening saying there was no sign of her car. So meanwhile, Maggie's calling repeatedly. She's just worried sick. A massive search was started by the Gunnison Sheriff, the Crested Butte Police Department, and the Civil Air Patrol. There are also many volunteers helping in the search.
Also, Michele's roommate gave the police Michele's hairbrush and eyeglasses to hold as evidence. And this would pay off much later, not right away, because we're in 1974. Technology and advancements in science had a long way to go.
They certainly did. It was very minimal.
Right. So it was on September 6th when Chuck Matthews heard about a missing girl on the radio. And when he heard the description of Michele and her dog, along with her last known whereabouts, he knew that she was the young woman that he had met with Melanson on August 30th. But of course, all he knows about Melanson is his first name is Roy. So Matthews called the sheriff's department and gave them a description of Michele, of her dog, and of her red Mazda wagon. The last time he had seen her was outside of the Columbine bar as she drove away with a man who he only knew as Roy. And this really sounded bad. This made the case sound a lot worse.
Well, yeah. I mean, she'd been last seen with a man she really didn't know, right?
Yeah.
She just met. No one knew who Roy was, or if Roy had even given his real name. Then the next day, a rancher called the sheriff's department to report that he had shot and killed a dog on September 4th, and this dog matched Okie's description. He had kept the dog's collar, which had a tag with Michele's name on it. Then other people called to tell the sheriff that they had seen the dog wandering around in the area since August 31st. Again, bad news, because Michele and Oki had been inseparable.
Yeah, so she's missing and her dog is dead, so it's really looking like foul play. Frank Spadafora was contacted after Chuck Matthews told the police that Roy had told him he had been killing coyotes for a sheep rancher in Schofield Park. Spadafora told them that he had employed a Roy, and he knew his last name. It was Roy Melanson.
We got a name now. That's good.
Yep. But of course, Melanson had left the area. He had arrived in Pueblo in Michelle's Mazda on August 31st, and he had spent the night with Sally, the 14-year-old, and got one of her sisters to drive him to where he had parked the Mazda. He told her that a friend had left it there for him to use. So at this point, I really have to question Sally's mother, Lucille Burton's, judgment here. What the hell's going on?
Well, it's almost like she's prostituting her daughter, you know.
Well, and he's kind of staying at their house, right?
Yeah.
It's very weird. And I don't know where the father was. I know he was working, but didn't he ever come home and see what's going on? It's really strange. Disturbing situation.
That's an understatement. So at this time, though, Melanson seemed to be doing much better financially than the last time the Burton girls had seen him. He had new clothes, new camping equipment, and a really nice camera. Now, Sally had used the camera. She took a picture of Melanson laying on the couch behind one of her friends.
Yeah, so what's this man doing in the house with these teenage girls laying on the couch? It's all so creepy, Dick.
It is.
I don't understand it.
And we don't have any information or any reasons why her mother treated things the way she did.
No, I mean, in what I've read about the case, there was always just the idea that he was such a smooth talker and so convincing. But to me, nobody's that convincing that you're going to let him hang around your 14-year-old. It's weird. Bad.
It really is.
Yeah.
Now, Melanson didn't stay in Pueblo very long. On September 8th, he was in Cedar Falls, Iowa. When he was there, he pawned Michelle's camera, backpack, and sleeping bag. Then in Elk City, Iowa, he met a guy named Thurman Wilder in a bar, and the two started talking. Wilder told him that he was a heavy equipment operator looking for a job, and Melanson told him that he had a friend in Pueblo who owned a construction company, and he was sure that his friend would hire Wilder.
I think he was just trying to get a ride there, I guess. He was always trying to get something from someone. He was quite the con man.
I mean, although he still had Michelle's Mazda at this point, right?
Yeah, I think he was looking to dump it because when they headed west, Melanson drove the Mazda and Wilder was in his white Cadillac. And when they got to Amarillo, Texas, Melanson dumped the Mazda and he ended up riding the rest of the trip with Wilder in the Cadillac. He had told Wilder that his car needed repairs and he was taking it to a shop and they'd pick it up on the way back. Then on September 12th, an anonymous caller reported a suspicious white Cadillac that was hanging around a high school. And the Cadillac was pulled over, and Melanson said that he and Wilder were just waiting to pick up Sally Burton at school, which is pretty creepy right there.
Yes, it is.
But when Melanson's driver's license was checked, the police discovered that he was wanted for rape in Texas. So both Melanson and Wilder were arrested, and Wilder gave permission for his car to be searched. And the police found several different items belonging to Michele Wallace in the Cadillac. These things included her car registration, her driver's license, insurance card, and also some of her camping equipment. So there's no explanation that he's going to be able to give for that.
There wouldn't appear to be. So Melanson was searched. Police found his unused bus ticket from Gunnison to Pueblo. They found a set of Mazda keys and 2 pawn tickets for a sleeping bag and a backpack. Then one of the officers remembered to be on the lookout for a red Mazda station wagon owned by Michele. Wow. So that's solved this crime, didn't we?
Well, no, not
really. I know. There's a twist.
There's a long way to go with that. The Pueblo detectives were pretty sharp, though. They contacted Gunnison and learned about the search for Michele. The Amarillo police found Michelle's car. It was abandoned 1 block from a bar called the Hard Hat Lounge. Now, the car was searched, but nothing was found that would have indicated foul play. so nothing they could use as evidence and nothing that would help them find Michele. Of course, they interviewed Melanson, and he finally did admit to spending time with the Burtons and to having a relationship with the teenage Sally, but he denied that he'd ever had sex with Sally. You know, they were just hanging around because they had so much in common together.
Yeah, they're just good friends.
Sure. A lot of grown men have 14-year-old girls as their friends.
Yeah, and they interviewed Sally. She told them that she had met Melanson in July near her family's cabin, and she said that she did actually have sex with him. So, contradictory stories here. I'm thinking I'm going to believe Sally.
Absolutely, and he had traumatized her quite a bit.
And so isn't this statutory rape?
Yes, should be. But you know, you're going to find here that he really gets away with a lot for a long time. It's really frustrating. After extensive interviews, Melanson insisted on speaking to the FBI, and eventually he said that he did remember meeting Michele. He said he had a drink with her in a bar, and she had left her dog tied up outside. Then he said he had made up an excuse to borrow her car, and she'd let him, so he'd just taken off in her car and had never seen her again. Not a very believable story.
No, especially since he had all her things on his possession.
Exactly.
When he was stopped. But anyway, we'll take his story. So investigators suspected Melanson in Michele's disappearance, also in 3 other Texas rapes, and a Texas murder. And then the police in Louisiana also wanted to question Melanson about a series of murders in their state. Nice guy.
So it looks like he's just done a lot of crimes that he's gotten away with. Chuck Matthews was brought in, and he was able to identify Melanson as the man in Michele's car when he last saw them. After that, detectives were convinced that they had Michele's killer. But without a body, the prosecutor wouldn't charge him with murder. So they were kind of stuck.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is 45 years ago, so things are different because we've done some cases where they've prosecuted successfully people with no body.
Well, it certainly can be done, but you need a lot of other evidence.
Well, it sounds like they got a fair amount.
The first thing, you have to be able to prove the person's dead. That's the first obstacle.
Well, you have to be able to maybe not prove, but beyond a shadow of doubt, say that they're dead.
Same thing to me.
Okay.
Yeah. So searchers, though, they continued to look on the ground and from the air for Michele. Maggie and George Wallace, her parents, held out hope that Michele would be found alive, of course. But they knew about Melanson's story, and they knew it was a lie. She wouldn't have loaned her car to a stranger. But unfortunately, no evidence was found that Michele had been killed, or, like I said, even that she was dead. Maggie knew she'd never see her daughter again. That started to set in, and she fell into a really deep depression. She was crying every day, and people said she just looked totally lost. 6 weeks after Michele had disappeared, the Colorado detectives asked for her dental records. That's a bad sign. So this basically meant that the hopes of finding Michele alive were fading away quickly.
And soon after that, Maggie killed herself. She made herself some tea and went to sleep beside George. When he woke up in the morning, she was dead. She had taken an overdose of barbiturates in her tea, and she left a note that read, "If you ever find our daughter, please bury her next to me. God."
It's just horrible. I mean, here we can see how the murder of one person destroys so many lives. Because now Maggie's lost her life, and George is missing a daughter and a wife. Michele's brother has lost his mother and his sister. I mean, it just goes on and on.
Still, the DA would not charge Melanson without Michele's body or more evidence. So investigators held out hope that in the fall, when hunters were out in the woods, someone would find her remains. Now, once winter came, there are going to be lots of snow, so searching is going to be impossible.
It's really difficult anyway. I mean, this is a rugged area. A lot of woods, mountains, hills, river, It's a tough search.
It's very rugged country.
It is.
So Melanson went to trial for check fraud in March of 1975. The main witness didn't show up. Apparently someone had called her, claiming to be the Gunnison County clerk, and said she didn't need to show up because a plea deal had been made. So without the witness, Melanson was acquitted. So he wasn't totally home free yet. He's just, at this point, gets sent to Texas, where he's going to stand trial for aggravated rape.
So it sounds like he or someone else called that witness and told her not to come and got away with that.
Right.
So Melanson was charged with kidnapping a woman and forcing her to drive him from Texas to Louisiana and then back to Texas again. And over the several days of travel, he had raped her repeatedly. He actually kept a pair of nylon stockings around her neck to control her, and he would just tighten them if she fought him or screamed. So this woman was tortured, basically. Now, she had escaped alive, but was institutionalized with multiple issues related to this trauma. So in many ways, her life was ruined. She escaped alive, but in what condition? So the jury found Melanson guilty of those charges. So under the 3 strikes habitual offender law in Texas, he was sentenced to life in prison. So you might think he can't hurt anyone again, right?
You could probably think that, right?
Right.
He's sentenced to life.
The Michele Wallace case was back in the news in 1979 after a hiker found a mass of hair, which had 2 long dark braids. And this was right near where Michele had last been seen. And that's how she wore her hair. The hair was sent to investigators at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and it was confirmed to be human.
Now, Kathy Young happened to be just a few years younger than Michele Wallace. She was the first female officer in the Gunnison Police Department in 1978. In 1985, she became the first female deputy at the Sheriff's Department. Now, she was contacted by the Crested Butte Police Department in the 80s and asked if she would be interested in taking on Michele's case. So we're getting, close to 10 years or more since Michele disappeared.
Yeah.
So definitely a cold case.
Yes, it was a cold case. And really, things didn't kick in until Kathy Young took over the case, although a lot of people helped her.
Right.
Young's boss gave her permission to work the case, and he agreed because he thought that the case was solvable. The possibility of finding Michele's remains, though, was very slim, but Kathy Young believed that she had enough other evidence to prosecute him. There was really a lot of good evidence in the file, more than she thought there would be. Back in April of 1975, a Gunnison inmate who was locked up with Melanson told the sheriff that Melanson had admitted to killing Michele. And he said that Melanson had also told him he hadn't killed the dog, and he knew that the dog had been left wandering up near Crested Butte. Melanson had also told the other inmate that Michele had extensive dental work, and he claimed that he'd used an axe to knock out her teeth to prevent her from being identified by her dental records if she ever was found. So this was pretty strong secondhand evidence, I guess.
Yeah, they even have another inmate who told a similar story.
Yeah, so that helped a lot.
So and then we also have Chuck Matthews. Now his description of the dirt road where Melanson had gotten out of the car with the rifle matched where Michele's hair had been found. Though it is possible that Melanson had planned to shoot Matthews on the road that day, but changed his mind because Matthews' car could have broken down and prevented him from getting away.
That's a good point, yeah. I could see that happening, yep.
Now, when Kathy Young called the Texas Department of Corrections to ask about interviewing Melanson, she was absolutely horrified to learn that he had been released in 1988.
I know, can you believe it?
Now, so his life sentence turned out to be only 13 years because his habitual offender conviction had been overturned.
Yeah, they really hadn't wanted to release this guy. He was known to be violent even in prison. He was suspected of beating a man to death in his cell block. But still, they had no proof on that either. And they hadn't been able to find his earlier rape victims to interview. The only one they could find was the one who was in the institution, who really wasn't up to testifying or even giving a deposition.
She wasn't going to be able to do anything in terms of testifying.
No, he really destroyed her spirit, her mind. It was just a terrible thing.
Now, Melanson was actually a suspect in several killings. He was the prime suspect in the disappearance of a Port Arthur woman who had gone missing shortly after Melanson had been released from prison in 1988. Melanson had been staying in the area in a small apartment building with a relative. That July, he was witnessed offering to help the landlady take her TV to a repair shop. Now, the very next day, her car was found outside of a grocery store with the TV still inside. The landlady was never seen again, and police suspected that she had been killed and dumped in the swamps that were running through the area. Melanson left the area soon after.
Yeah, so women who are seen with him have a habit of disappearing.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. In 1989, the following year, Melanson was in Kentucky, and he was arrested and convicted for a burglary. He was captured for this crime while living on a Montana ranch with another woman, and she was shocked when she heard about his history because he'd convinced her that he was a wealthy farmer from Texas, and they had a relationship. So he did have some kind of way of charming people, apparently.
I guess so. Now, this time when he was convicted as a habitual offender, and he was supposed to serve 20 years. But when Young spoke to the prison authorities, she learned he could be up for parole in as little as 5 years. Things are just wacky, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, this just makes you doubt the whole system, doesn't it?
I guess so.
But Kathy Young was working hard on Michele's case. She re-interviewed witnesses, including Chuck Matthews and all of the Burtons. The problem was that without Michele's body, the prosecution would have a really hard time proving a murder. They really didn't even have evidence that Michele was dead, other than no one had heard from her. And she hadn't used her bank or anything, you know.
Right. I mean, she's just vanished from the face of the earth.
Right. But even if they could convince a jury that she was deceased, it would really be hard to reach the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt for Melanson to be convicted of murder. So they really weren't ready to go for that right away. They wanted to get more stuff, more evidence.
Gonna keep on looking.
Yeah.
So in 1991, so we're several years into this now. I mean, several years for Kathy Young and almost 20 years since she disappeared, Michele.
Yeah.
So she re-inventoried the evidence in Michele's case, and she found the hairbrush. There were still several strands of dark hair in it. So she finally had a way to identify the braids that had been found in 1979 as belonging to Michele. She sent the hairbrush and braids to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's lab in August of 1991, and the results came back as a match. They didn't have any DNA on it, so the identification was not anywhere near 100% certain.
Now, back in the 90s, I think there was a stronger belief in the hair matching, but now we know, don't we, that it's really not that accurate.
It isn't, unless you have DNA.
Right, and you'd have to have the bulb of the hair, which they didn't have.
Right. But if you're just comparing hairs, right now the best you can do is say they're similar. You can't say they're a match.
Exactly.
But in 1991 they apparently did.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it wasn't as good as DNA or anything, but it did have some weight, apparently.
Yeah.
Which it probably has some weight now. It's just that it's definitely not a true science without the bulb.
Right.
So that October, Kathy Young, the detective, drove to Denver and presented the case to NecroSearch International. NecroSearch is a volunteer, multidisciplinary team of scientists and former policemen who help law enforcement in the location of hidden graves and help recover evidence, and that includes human remains. They were interested in Young's presentation of Michele's case and actually were very eager to help.
So they're going to provide some expertise in this, right?
Absolutely,
I mean,
yes.
I'd never heard of NecroSearch. That's a pretty cool thing.
They're actually quite amazing. They've done a lot. And they were definitely helpful in this case. More helpful than they thought they could be, actually.
So a grid system was used to search the area where Michele had last been seen. And they also looked at aerial photos to assess the region. Now, when winter set in, they weren't able to search, but they could determine where the Mazda could have been driven and the various areas where a body could have been buried or hidden. So prosecutors wanted to get Melanson for first-degree murder, to guarantee that he would never be able to victimize anyone else. Now, for this, of course, they're going to have to prove that he had planned to kill Michele, and that premeditation could be just for minutes.
For seconds, really, right?
Just decide to do it, right?
Exactly. So he was served with an arrest warrant in his prison cell in April of 1992. Then in August of 1992, the necro-search team searched the area where Michele's hair had been found. And on the second day of the search, Cecilia Travis, one of the necro-search team members, was on her way up a hill when she noticed a flicker of something shiny on the ground. And after she took a closer look, she saw that it was a gold tooth on a human skull. The team set up a grid system around the area to search for more remains. So this was a much bigger find than the hair.
It certainly was, wasn't it?
Right. Then right up the hill from the skull, they found 2 femurs, which are thigh bones, several vertebrae, backbones, a partial pelvis, and some other small bones. They also found a hiking boot with foot bones inside of it. So it's very macabre.
Then a forensic odontologist confirmed that Michele's dental records matched the skull. Prosecutors charged Melanson with first-degree murder without a body, but the remains made their case against him that much stronger.
I would say it's 100% stronger.
Much.
10 times stronger, maybe.
So he didn't knock all her teeth out.
He missed one. At least one. The trial lasted for 30 days, which is a pretty long time for a trial. And one interesting thing is that Melanson refused to be in the courtroom. He actually claimed that this was in protest of the stun belt he was required to wear while in the courtroom, because he was considered that much of a danger, that if he got out of hand, they could push a button and shock him. But prosecutors also believed that part of the reason he didn't want to be in the courtroom was because he wasn't comfortable sitting there and seeing Michele's remains, which they displayed during the case. So the court set up a live telephone connection between the courtroom and Melanson's cell so he could speak with his attorney when he had a question. And also the judge allowed the prosecution to take jurors to the scene so they could see where Michele's body had been dumped over the side of a hill.
And now the bones were not a positive identification.
No, things were not as advanced as they are now.
The prosecution called 39 witnesses, and they presented 55 exhibits, and the remains were the strongest evidence. Thanks to necrosearch, there is proof that Michele was no longer alive. Circumstantial evidence allowed them to put together a timeline for Melanson having committed the murder.
So there was no witness, though, who could say how Michele had died. But they did have an expert they brought in who could testify to the circumstances of how her body had been left by her killer. The original site where her body was dumped was believed to be 25 feet below the dirt road at the base of a tree, and it was believed that she was thrown there from that road. So he might have scoped out that area when he was with Matthews.
He very well could have.
I think when he was in the car with her, he was probably planning this whole thing. He was getting in the front seat, chatting her up, and decided once they dropped off Matthews that he would take off with her and then he'd have her.
Exactly.
I guess the dog was too friendly, not protective enough.
Well, it didn't attack anybody, right?
No, it didn't try and defend her that we know of. Although who knows? He could have tried.
Sure. Now, none of Melanson's other crimes could be brought up in this trial. His defense attorney said that the evidence showed Melanson was a thief, but was not a murderer. Wistful thinking. In closing arguments, the prosecutor brought special attention to the condition of a front zipper, believed to be from Michele's jeans. It was clasped at the top, but the other side had been ripped off. And this, according to the prosecution, showed motive as a sexual assault.
Yeah, there were only 5 hours of deliberation before the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, and they sentenced him to life in prison, which would follow his Kentucky sentence that he already had. So Michele's remains, the family finally had them, what was left of the family, and her remains were buried with her mother's. George Wallace eventually remarried, and this was a very kind, supportive woman. I believe she was a widow as well. Her name was Melba. And during Melanson's trial, she was with George. But then Melba was diagnosed with terminal cancer around the same time. So it's really a sad coincidence that George was given Melba's and Michele's remains on the very same day. So George has had a rough life.
George has certainly had a rough life. And it even gets rougher. 22 years later, in January 2006, 2 men broke into George's St. Petersburg home and beat him to death. They robbed the house, took George's car. Now, George at this point is 85 years old and confined to a wheelchair.
So pretty helpless.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's no direct connection to Michele's murder, but George's family was down to just George and his son George Jr. when he died. So Melanson had taken his daughter's life, and he was really directly responsible for Maggie's suicide as well.
Certainly was.
So that's why George was probably alone, because he'd lost these people in his life. So it's just desperately sad what happened to the entire family.
After the murder conviction, Melanson was sent back to Kentucky to finish that sentence. Then in 2003, he's returned to Colorado to begin his life sentence for Michele's murder. Now, while he was in prison, DNA testing had advanced a great deal. And lo and behold, another murder in Melanson's past caught up with him.
Yeah, it turns out he was a serial killer. His DNA was entered into the National Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, databank, and in 2009, the CODIS databank got a match for another 1974 murder, and that's the murder of Anita Andrews.
On July 10th, 1974, 51-year-old Anita Andrews went to work at the bar she and her sister had inherited from their father. Faggiani's Cocktail Lounge was in a dodgy area of Napa Valley, so this obviously is before it hit its stride as a trendy tourist area for wine.
Yes, it would end up being in a very much better area years down the road. And according to Anita's sister, Anita really wasn't happy to be working at that bar. She had a good day job as a secretary at the Napa State Hospital. But the sisters planned to sell the bar, and it had to be open a certain amount of time in order to keep their liquor license. And they knew any prospective buyers would want a liquor license, so they had to run the bar like 24 hours a week just to keep that license. But they were both anxious to sell it.
So Anita's sister Muriel handled the books, and Anita worked the bar. Anita had graduated from business school. She had married. She had 2 daughters. Now, the marriage was long ago dissolved, and she had moved back to Napa 20-some years before she disappeared. And in 1974, Anita's daughters were grown, and they were away living their own lives. Anita was pretty well known in town. She was always well dressed, and she drove a nice Cadillac. She hadn't remarried, but she did have an off-again, on-again boyfriend. No one else seemed to know much of anything about this guy. Anita said he had worked for a carnival, and he traveled a lot.
And that sounds a little shady right there.
No kidding.
About a week earlier, she had told her daughter that she was done with this guy. He'd run up a $400 phone bill at their apartment. She was holding his tools in her car until he gave her the money for the phone bill. But she was pretty much done with him, she said. So, on the evening of July 10th, 1974, this was a typical evening at the bar. Only a few customers came in, and they were mostly local men who were just bar hopping. But there was a man seen there by the other customers who was sitting on a stool at the end of the bar, and he was playing around with a deck of cards and smoking cigarettes and clearly flirting with Anita. The 3 local guys noticed the man at the bar, and they didn't recognize him. And they noticed he had a bit of a southern accent, and he was kind of hiding his face. He was definitely not being friendly with them. And then at 9 p.m., Anita started cleaning up for the night and encouraged the 3 locals out of the bar. But since she wasn't moving to get the guy at the bar to leave, one of the locals asked her if he was her boyfriend. And she actually nodded, but the local man wasn't sure if she was just trying to hurry him along or if this guy really was her boyfriend.
The next morning, Muriel got a call from her mother because Anita had not shown up for her day job. So she asked Muriel to go check on her. Muriel went to Anita's apartment first, but there was no Cadillac and no Anita there. So she went to check at the bar.
Yeah, when Muriel got to the bar, she noticed immediately that the door was missing its padlock and that the Cadillac wasn't there. She went inside and saw all of the bar stools were neatly pushed up to the bar, except for the one on the end, and that was where that guy had been sitting. And the counter was all clean, except there was an ashtray at the end of the bar in front of that stool where the guy had been sitting. When Muriel pushed through the doors to the storeroom, she found her sister Anita half naked and dead on the floor, in a large pool of blood. It was a gruesome scene. Obviously, Anita had put up a fight. There was blood and broken glass all over the place. And Anita's clothing was torn and partially removed. Her jewelry was missing, as well as her purse and her keys. And of course, the car was missing from the lot out back. So it looked like she'd been robbed and murdered and quite possibly sexually assaulted.
Now, one of the local men that had been there the night before described a stranger who had been sitting at the end of the bar. He was a guy in his mid-30s with very thin lips. The man said he had passed back by the outside of the bar about an hour after he and his friends had left. The Cadillac had been gone then, and the lights in the bar were off.
The autopsy showed that Anita had been hit on her head with a bottle and then probably dragged into the storeroom, where she fought and she got very bruised and injured. She also had a broken nose, and they found out that she had been stabbed 13 times with a screwdriver. The stranger at the end of the bar was the prime suspect, of course. Some people thought he must have been the boyfriend who said he was working for the carnival and traveling. Some other people thought he matched a description of a welder who Anita had known. So nobody really knew him. No name. It makes it a tough case to solve. There really wasn't a lot to go on. It took a month for the Napa police to learn that Anita's credit card had been used. That's how slow things were. They knew that it had been used around midnight on the night of the murder, and they found out that a tan Cadillac pulled into a Sacramento truck stop 60 miles northwest of Napa and bought $10 worth of gas with the credit card. The attendant, when he was interviewed, said he had noticed a purse on the back seat and also a towel on the driver's lap that appeared to have blood on it. But he said the driver was very calm, so he didn't worry about it. He didn't call anyone. Now, I kind of feel like you should call the police when you're suspicious about something like that.
Well, yeah, I guess it depends on how weird it looked to you.
Right. But you see a guy driving around, there's no woman, but there's a purse in the back. And then between that and the bloody towel, I think it might be worth a call.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at it that way. But, I mean, it might not have been exactly the way that it's presented.
I know, it's just, in a lot of these stories, you feel like if someone had just called, some of these things could have been prevented and lives could have been saved.
Well, I mean, yeah, and if you look at it that way, it's obvious that the station attendant should have called the police.
Sure.
But they didn't.
No, so Anita's case went cold after just 2 months of investigation. But the evidence was bagged and it was stored. It included bottles with unknown fingerprints on them, a cigarette butt from the ashtray, and a screwdriver found in the sink of the storeroom, which they thought was the murder weapon, plus a copy of the gas station receipt from Sacramento.
Now, in 2009, the cigarette butt was matched to Melanson's DNA.
So that's what, like 35 years after?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's a very cold case.
Well, and it's only because his DNA got entered into the system.
Yes, exactly.
So Melanson was charged and tried in September of 2011. He's convicted, and another life term was added to his sentence.
Well, then there was another one in 2010, another match to Melanson's DNA. And this was for the 1988 murder of a woman in Louisiana, Charlotte Sarwin. Her fiancé, Vince Lejeune, arrived home from work on August 6, 1988, to find Charlotte gone. Now, he and Charlotte were going to get married and have kids, and they had planned to build their dream home. They were both just 24 years old. And when it got dark that night, Vince was really getting worried. It wasn't like Charlotte to be out on her own after dark. She had left her protective pit bull at home, but her Beretta semi-automatic handgun was gone. So Vince went to Charlotte's parents' house next door, and Charlotte's father told him that he had seen Charlotte leave the house about 2 p.m. that day. Then Vince checked at friends' houses, and one friend told him he'd seen Charlotte at the laundromat talking to a strange man, and he wasn't sure if they had left together or not.
So Vince then checked the property where he and Charlotte planned to build their dream house, because Charlotte sometimes liked to go there, just hang out, listen to music, and dream about the future. So as Vince arrived at the property, he saw Charlotte's car just off the road on the grass, and Charlotte was found with her throat slashed.
Yeah, her fiancé Vince actually lived under a cloud of suspicion for 22 years. This was a small town. Everyone knew him. They really made his life miserable, but he refused to move away because he said that was his hometown. So he was treated like crap, basically, very shitty, for 22 years until Melanson's DNA was identified as a match to some DNA that they had found on Charlotte's body.
Well, and then, of course, everyone came up to him afterwards and said, "We knew you didn't do it."
Yeah, right. I just can't imagine living your life like that. It's awful. He's already lost his love.
I don't think I could hang around in that town for very long. If every place I go, people are looking at me and pointing fingers at me.
I know, isn't it horrible?
I just couldn't stay there.
Especially for something that you're mourning over. You know, it's terrible.
Right.
So I had never heard of Melanson before reading about this, but it seems like he could have been a very prolific serial killer. So we definitely know about 4 murders? Yeah, 4 murders.
Yeah.
So there are probably a lot more. Yeah. Plus all the rapes and all the other crimes.
Yeah.
And he really was a terrible human being who victimized a lot of mostly women. So if you want to find out more about these cases, I would really recommend a book called Smooth Talker by Steve Jackson. And Steve Jackson has written a lot of books. He actually wrote a book about necrosearch, which includes this case and some others, and that's titled No Stone Unturned. So there really isn't a lot else out there besides some articles, except there is a Forensic Files episode titled Corpus Delicti. Forensic Files, while it's interesting to watch, it usually has a very narrow path that it goes to. You don't find out that much else about the case, but very fascinating, this necrosearch. Definitely something I think a lot of our listeners might want to read about.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. Learn something new.
Absolutely, and they had really started it years ago.
Okay, time for you to plug our podcast, Jill.
Okay, our September TCB Premium episode was all about Pastor A.B. Shermer, who was charged with killing 2 wives, and it's called A Wolf in Shepherd's Clothing. Definitely an eye-opening case to research and an enjoyable discussion for us. We're currently finishing up our research on our October members-only episode. You want to tell us anything about that, Dick? Give us just a taste of what's coming up with that.
Well, interestingly, it's about another serial killer or spree killer. His name is Christopher Wilder, and he's a native of Australia. He killed at least 9 women.
Oh, my God.
In his lifetime. So I'm just about done with that. It'll be a good discussion.
Absolutely, yeah. That's another one I had never heard about before.
No, me either.
So if you'd like some more TCB in your life, just go to tiegrabber.com, click on subscribe, and you can listen to the members-only episodes. We've been doing them for over 2 years now, so there's quite a few of them available. If you're really itching between Tuesdays, give it a try. Another thing, when you visit our website, I would suggest you check out our shop, which is all new. We have just about everything that you could want to put our logos on, and very good prices. In collaboration with TeePublic, you really get a bargain on t-shirts, sweatshirts, cups, pins, pretty much anything.
Pretty much you name it.
Yeah.
Good quality stuff.
Yeah. We certainly appreciate your support that you give to the show, and we thank you in advance, whether you listen every week, contribute your comments or suggestions, support our sponsors, or subscribe to True Crime Brewery Premium, or even doing some shopping at the brewery. We appreciate it all. So let's get right into feedback.
As per my recent habit, we're going to do 1 voicemail and 2 emails. So we have a voicemail from Claire, who has a case suggestion.
Hi, Dick. Hi, Jill. My name is Claire, and I live in rural Alaska. I've been listening to you guys for about a year now, and I finally got around to leaving a voicemail. I live so far out that I don't get cell phone reception or internet where I live, so once a week I come into town, and I'm always excited to download your latest episode. I really enjoyed your coverage of the Deborah Dean case, which is pretty hard to find information on. I was raised in Kansas, and I remember the neighborhood where that happened. It was a very swanky area, and everyone was very shocked that anything like that would happen there. So I wanted to request that you cover the case of Anthony and Debbie Pignataro. Anthony was a doctor who mutilated people with his negligence and even killed one woman. He went to prison for that, and when he got out, he then poisoned his wife. So there's a lot of medical aspects to this case that I would absolutely love to hear Dick's take on. And his victim, Debbie, actually survived. So for once, it doesn't have a horrible ending, but She sounds like a remarkable lady, and Jill has a great ability to put herself in the shoes of the victim, so I'd be really curious to hear your take on that case. And last of all, I want to issue you, Dick, a challenge to find a beer I actually like. I don't like bitter flavors. I really like sweet and sometimes sour flavors, so the closest thing to beer I like is lambic, which is like raspberry or cherry Belgian beer. So if you have a recommendation for me, I will order it and let you know what I think. So see you at the Quiet Inn. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Claire.
Yeah, this Anthony Pignataro is something. This guy's supposedly a plastic surgeon. Not sure where he trained or what, but anyway, he was practicing as a plastic surgeon, and one of his patients, 26-year-old woman who was having breast augmentation, went into cardiac arrest and died. He was the first Western New York doctor to be convicted of a homicide and jailed for a patient's death.
So that's really fascinating. What do you have to do to go beyond negligence to murder? I mean, this guy was obviously a hack, but...
Well, he had numerous botched surgeries.
So he probably wasn't, what do you call it, accredited or...
So he wasn't board certified.
Yeah, yeah.
And he just was a crappy doctor. Anyway, he goes to jail.
That seems like you're putting it mildly, a crappy doctor.
He served 2 years for this patient's death.
Now, why only 2 years? What the hell is that?
Don't know. I'm going to research some more.
Okay, I can't wait to hear.
So he gets out of jail, and the next thing he tries to do is poison his wife, Debbie, with arsenic.
So she'd stayed with him through that?
She'd stayed with him. She stood by her man.
Oh, Debbie.
Now, he pled guilty to the poisoning, and he was jailed for the next 15 years. This time when he got out of prison, it's 2013, and less than a year after his release, he changed his name from Anthony Pignataro to Anthony Haute, Haute, and he filed papers creating a business in the area called Tony Haute Cosmetique, LLC. So he's still looking to do something. This is despite him surrendering his medical license and promising never to practice medicine again.
Yeah, that's very iffy. It sounds like he was going to do Botox or some kind of medical cosmetic procedures.
Yeah, and he's passing himself off as like a retired physician or something like that.
Wow.
So
that does sound fascinating. That's a great recommendation, Claire.
I'm going to be looking for that. The little bit I saw just really caught my interest.
Fascinating, yes. All right, what about the beer challenge? Did you come up with a beer?
Well, maybe. If Claire likes fruity beers and kind of, sweet fruity beers and maybe likes a little bit of a sour, my suggestion would be to look up beers from Cascade Brewing, because they specialize in these kind of wild ales that are fruity and sour. The only downside to me is they're relatively expensive, like $25 to $35 for a 750 ml bottle.
Well, what about Mikkeller? I love Mikkeller's sour.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that'd be real available in Alaska, but maybe. Yeah, there's a bunch of Mikkeller, Spontan, Blueberry, Spontan.
Oh, those
cherry.
are delicious. They're sweet, but they're tart. Those are my favorites.
So look up Mikkeller, Claire, and look up Cascade.
Okay, great.
I think you'll find something you like there.
Great. So Christine wrote in with a case suggestion. Greetings from the loud end of the bar. Here I am. I'm the lady sitting by the old jukebox, the one that takes nickels and only has songs in it from the 80s. I was wondering whether or not you have heard about or are interested in the Kurum case. It's a famous case from the Czech Republic. A man, setting up a baby monitor in preparation for the birth of his first child, picks up a stray signal revealing a young child locked in a squalid room. The police investigate and discover 2 severely abused little boys and what appears to be a mentally disabled adolescent girl, all under the control of the mother of the boys and her sister. As the case unfolds, the actual complexities of the case are revealed. As it turns out, there's no disabled adolescent girl, but a somewhat confused 30-something-year-old woman masquerading as a child. Is she a victim? Another villain? While the case is interesting as a narrative, the actual situation that these children were in and the potentials to which they were subjected is highly disturbing. It's hard to separate what is sensational from what is actual. It still seems unclear what the motives for this abuse were, but the mother's involvement with a religious cult seems to have been a factor. This is one of those cases where I think that the tragedy of the victims gets lost in the complexity of the rabbit hole. But I wish you well and lots of good beer. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you very much. There is a book that we're going to get to check this out. It's called The Curum Case, A Terrifying True Story of Child Abuse, Cults, and Cannibalism by an author named Ryan Green.
Cannibalism? Christine didn't mention that. That sounds horrible.
So we're going to check this out.
Okay.
Another one of those cases.
Sounds wacky and terrifying.
Yeah, and we're also the people that listen to the 80s songs.
Absolutely. Although you like your fair share of 70s, too.
Well, you know,
and even the 90s.
I'm so old.
But the 80s is fun. 80s is fun music. So the next case suggestion is from Cindy.
Cindy's one of our frequent contributors.
Friend of the show, Cindy, I call her.
We love Cindy. She always has great observations and insights and has made some excellent suggestions for cases.
Absolutely.
So this time, she wants us to look into Nick Hackney, who was a youth pastor. He killed his wife, and he had not only one, but 5 mistresses. And his church on Bainbridge Island, Washington, called Community Christ Church, was just torn apart. Now, I guess the good thing was they had no kids, so it's just one dead wife, no dead children.
Yes, I remember this case quite well from a 48 Hours or a Dateline. And we also have bought a book about it called A Twisted Faith, so it's likely that we will do that case at some point.
Absolutely. So that's feedback for today.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dick.
Thank you, Jill.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll see you next week at the Quiet Ed.
Come join us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.